So welcome back to my channel, welcome back to Murder Hero. So today I'm doing a series of videos and this one's going to be a long one. It's based upon probably one of the most celebrated and the most probably famous serial killers called Jack the Ripper. But obviously, as I said, I do videos which is unsolved. That's what I'm dealing at the moment, because I wanted to shed a light on, obviously, to bring up a bit of a debate about these serial killers, who could be the person and if they can be caught or kind of identified. But obviously this person's dead and gone now, but I wanted to kind of like go a bit more in depth about this actual serial killer who is called Jack the Ripper. So this video is going to be looking at a range of different identities of who Jack the Ripper was and his victims. So first of all, I'm going to look at the suspects who possibly there could be, and also I'm going to look at the people who actually were his victims, and some who they say is his victims and some that weren't classed as his victims, but yet the police put into the same category as the Whitechapel murders, hence why they kind of said it was Jack the Ripper. But a lot of people say he didn't actually do it. But what I'm going to do, each video, I'm going to delve down into each victim who died. So there's probably about 9. So this is going to be the first. So there's going to be, it's going to altogether going to be about 10. And the important thing is to really look about their life and what these people had and what they lost, and why did they end up from such probably prestigious places to live in Whitechapel in the 18th century, working as a prostitute. So that's what I'm going to kind of address. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be looking at the various people that they say is Jack the Ripper. But the other point I'm looking at, which is a really interesting debate, that could Jack the Ripper actually be female? And that's what I'm going to really delve into, because I think it's a really possible cause it could be, because again, she just disappeared into the crowd and was never caught. And even when it was almost caught, they could never ever identify the person or who it could be. So again, that's a plausible kind of view on who Jack the Ripper is. So that's one thing I'm going to be looking at. The other thing is, well, I'm going to be delving into the locations, the life before they died or before they were killed. So I'm going to look at their life in Whitechapel. Then I'm going to look at the murder itself. Then the inquest is what I'm going to look at as well. What happened at the inquest, and obviously when they were brought in for autopsy, the medical testimony. So what the actual pathologist said about what happened to these victims. Then I'm going to delve into the investigations. Now the investigations, obviously how and what kind of mistakes they made and what mistakes they didn't make, and how close they probably were to catching him or her. Then I'm going to do a conclusion. So each video, that's what I'm going to be looking at. So the list of people I'm going to be looking at, which I think is really important, I just wanted to make it quite clear. There apparently is about 9 victims who died at the hand of Jack the Ripper, or died, we were put into the idea of the murders in Whitechapel. So again, let me just, before I start this, I just wanted to say that Jack the Ripper, obviously, when this took place, was in the 18th century, and it spanned for roughly about a year, more or less a year. So let me just tell you who the people, I'm not going to put in what order, but I'm just going to say the names of the victims people say were actually Jack the Ripper's victims. So you got Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Mary Jane Nichols, Martha Baparam, I think I've got that name right, Alice Mackenzie, Frances Coles, and Emma Elizabeth Smith. So each of those I'm going to go and drill down into who they were and what they were about, and also some of the suspects, which I'm going to run the names across now, but who the suspects were, because I'm not going to start delving into some names, because some of them are obviously are foreign, and I don't want to just try and get my tongue tied around it all. So the name's going to be running across there. Now the murder took place in Whitechapel, as I said, in the 18th century. So it started roughly about April 1888 and finished in February 1891, where the last murder was committed. Now the first murder wasn't necessarily by Jack the Ripper, but they say it was, because it had his kind of style. The other point I wanted to point out as well is that I'll be delving into all these videos will be really drilling down into how, and obviously talking about a bit more demographic, not because I see a lot of videos when they talk about obviously about Jack the Ripper, they just kind of glaze across each murder, but I want to try to really delve down to what the person was like, and I want to really identify who these victims were, and more about the victims than opposed to about their passing or their murder, is because I think it's important. I want to kind of clarify that these people were people and they had lives, and it's important that we looked at where they were and why they ended up there, than just that they were prostitutes and they were murdered by this madman. But I just wanted to kind of really delve down to give these people a life. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is that the first minute, I'm just going to quickly glaze across it in this video, just to kind of delve down to kind of whet your appetite. So I'm just going to read some of this information I've got here. It says, on the 3rd of April 1888 at 1:30 a.m. Elizabeth Smith was found that she was attacked by a group of people, and she was savagely beaten. Unfortunately, she passed away on the 4th of April 1888. But then they grouped that murder into the Whitechapel murders, which fell under Jack the Ripper murders, but wasn't exactly done by Jack the Ripper. The second one was the 7th of August 1888. Another prostitute, Martha, was found stabbed to death in a loading bay at the George Yard building. So that was at the gates. She was found brutally murdered. That was confirmed to be Jack the Ripper's kind of key murder. That's the first one they claimed that he did do. In August the 31st, 1888, at 3:40, a body of Mary Ann Nichols was found, and she was found, but actually she was the first victim. So the next victim, it was said this in September, the 1st of September, was in 1888, was the police found a apron which they believed belonged to Jack the Ripper. This is when things got really excitable, because they had some kind of evidence that this person left this behind and was a clue to the identity of this serial killer. So then on the 8th of September 1888 at 6 a.m, Jack the Ripper killed Annie Chapman. She was found at the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, which is again in Whitechapel. She was brutally murdered. Again, as I said, I'm going to go into a bit more in depth about these people and how they passed. But I'm just kind of giving you an overflow of what this video or what this series is going to be about. So on the 10th of September, a guy was found his apron, as I mentioned before, and they wanted to really find out what the hell this apron was about. So they done a lot of tests into it, and they had two possible ideas it could be. One was George Lust, and the other one was John Pitzer. So they didn't know. So again, I'm going to go into a bit more in depth about these people when I start tweeting about the suspects. So the other thing that happened was on the 27th of September 1888, there was a message sent into the Central News Agency, which was kind of like the newspapers of that day, and it's signed off saying the boss. So the boss of the person who ran the newspaper, and at the end it was signed Jack the Ripper. That's where the name came from. So moving on the 30th of September, the body of Elizabeth Stride was found in Brewer Street, just off the Commercial Road, which again, in the old days, the streets were really narrow and it was really kind of like cobble streets. So it wasn't as open. If you've been to London, in Whitechapel, it wasn't as it is today. Because if you go around the back of Whitechapel, that's kind of what it's like, where you've got the really narrow streets and where it's really hard to maneuver through. So you could just and remember, try and picture that it would be dark, and in them days the ventilation, and you had lots of smoke, because remember we had the tube, and we had, or not tubes, but you had the trains which were giving off all the smoke. You had industrial stuff happening then, so it had a lot of smog. So the smog would kind of at night time block the narrow view of people just moving about. So this is why people can get away with the stuff they did do back then. So on the 30th of September again, Catherine Eddowes was discovered in Mitre Street. That was in central London as well. The police was baffled. They were going like, what the hell can we do? They couldn't, there was obviously no CCTVs. The only thing they could really have is eyewitnesses, and there was a time when it almost caught him, but it got to a point where he could just disappear and nobody knew who he was. So as he moved on, a letter came in on the 1st of October 1888 from Jack the Ripper, again kind of like speaking about how infamous he is and no one could really catch him. And then on the 6th of October 1888, the Central News Agency kind of like opened up and would kind of show to the public this letter. Remember, they kept it quiet, but they kind of now gave it to the media, to the country, to the world, about who this person was. It kind of named him. And then on the 16th of October 1888, there was another letter which was addressed to Mr. George Lust, which it says that from hell it contains half a kidney. So again, Jack the Ripper stepping up his game. He's sending in body parts now, and people were getting really fearful, and they believed the kidney was from Catherine Eddowes. So on the 9th of November 1888 at 20:25, another body was found. Now this was of Mary Kelly. She was found at 13 Miller's Court, which is Dorset Street, which is near Spitalfield, which is not far from like Bishopsgate or Liverpool Street. And again, that was one of his last victims, but they believe was done by Jack the Ripper himself. And again, remember I said about the other people and the possible kind of like Whitechapel murders. They tried to put it all under Jack the Ripper to say that he committed these crimes. And then you had on the 20th of December 1888, a 29-year-old Rose Maylitt, who was known as Catherine Millet or Liz Davies. She was found in Clark's Yard of Poplar High Street. And again, they examined her body, and in their opinion, she was strangled. But Robert Anderson, who was the person who was doing the investigation, was convinced that she accidentally hanged herself, which I don't know if she would. But her collar was kind of, they said she was drunk, but the doctor said that after examining her body, they agreed that she didn't, and then they said that they came under the verdict that she was murdered, and she was brutally murdered because her death was known as a murder, therefore she wasn't a suicide. Then as it starts winding down, on the 17th of July 1889, the body of Alice Mackenzie was found in Castle Alley, just off Whitechapel High Street, which again was a bit of a shock, because again it went a bit quiet, but then all these bodies started appearing again. So then on the 10th of September 1889, a torso of a woman was found beneath a railway yard in Pinkchurch Street, and they believe it was left there by Jack the Ripper, and they believe it belonged to one of his victims because he used to mutilate the body and take things away with him. And then lastly, on the 13th of February 1891, the body of Francis Cole was found beneath a railway yard near Swallows Gardens. And it was a spectacle. It was just like all these people were dying. A sailor named James Thomas Sadler was arrested and charged with the murder, but today believed that it wasn't actually him. It was actually believed to be Jack the Ripper. So that was the last of the murders they believed that was done by Jack the Ripper. Now, again, all these murders took place, well over 100 years, 200 years ago. And what was significant for me and why I found this really interesting, why I wanted to do a really long series of videos and really looking at these victims and who they were, and really trying to get across these victims that they just wasn't victims, they were actual people. And because you just hear the stories about the mutilation and the killings and all the rest of it, I wanted to explain, to bring them to life, was because I grew up not far from Whitechapel, and I used to go to school not far from Whitechapel, so I actually used to go to a school in Brick Lane. And Brick Lane was on the same road leading, it was about a 10-minute walk to get to Whitechapel. And we used to, after school, go to Whitechapel, but you always knew it was really eerie around that place, and being someone who can tap into stuff like that, I really felt uncomfortable there. But as I grew up, I was really fascinated in the story about this man or woman who possibly went around just terrorizing people. Nobody was safe. But what I found really amazing, let me just explain roughly about the prostitutes back then, or the ladies of the night. In them days, you used to have to pay for lodgings, and in them days you'd have to earn something like a couple pence or a couple pounds to have a bed for the night. Some people would have to sleep on, I think it's called a rope, a sleeping rope. So the rope was tied to some posts, and people used to just lean against it and sleep on that. So when these ladies of the night, prostitutes, will go and will sleep with somebody or get their favors to get money, they will go and have the room for the night, or will probably have somewhere to live in order for them to survive. Remember, in them days, there was no benefit system, there was none of that. It was just, if you weren't earning, you weren't eating. So again, a lot of these people fell in hard times. And again, talking to someone recently, that there was no difference from today than it is to then. In them days, if you fell in hard times, you ended up on the street, and then you had to survive. But in these days, if you fell in hard times, you end up on the street as well. Okay, it may not be as tragic because there's a lot more kind of like support today, but in them days it was, but it wasn't as welcoming. It was going through this radical change. So there was people who were coming out trying to break poverty and change poverty, but I just want to say that it wasn't as open and as clear as it is that we see today. So it's kind of like to appreciate what we have today, but back in the day of Jack the Ripper, the fear, you can imagine the fear that these women still went out to these places, they still went out to earn money, they still went out not because they wanted to, because they had to. So when I'm talking about these ladies and these people were killed, 9 people that were murdered, keep in mind that these people wasn't doing it because they wanted to, it wasn't something they enjoyed doing, it's something they had to do. So if you put yourself in their shoes, and if you needed a bed for the night, but the fear as well, that having, it being really dark, smoky, dingy, there was no street lamps. It was street lamps, but it was more paraffin done, so it was more lit by fire, not lit by electricity, because electricity wasn't done around then. So can imagine the fear in them days, what it must have been like. Just walking through London sometimes, even now when we have street lamps and police cameras and all this stuff, it's still fearful. You still get murders going on, you still get people attacking people. So you can imagine in them days, they were still going to the pubs, they were still going out having a good time, because that's all they knew. So just bear in mind, when I start talking about these individuals and these victims, about their life, and that it wasn't necessarily something they wanted to do, and I want to really bring them to life. This is what this is about. So that's my first video, the introduction to the Jack the Ripper series and these victims, and I'll see you in the next video, which I'm going to delve a bit more deeper into the actual victims themselves. So look after yourself, stay safe, and thanks for watching. Before I go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit that button for any videos that are coming up, especially when I'm doing the channel, because I'm going to be doing off and on videos based upon the actual suspects, so not just about the victims. I'm going to talk about the suspects, so it's going to be entwined in between, so be aware of that. And don't forget to subscribe, and so you can be a part of the channel. It helps me to generate more videos because this is one of my passions. So I'll see you soon, and thanks so much, and look after yourself.